Imagine waking up every morning, knowing your job is to carefully remove someone's brain through their nose, wash their body with wine, and wrap them in hundreds of yards of linen. Welcome to the life of an ancient Egyptian mummy maker, where death wasn't the end, but the beginning of the most important transformation a person could undergo. Today we're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating and misunderstood professions. What was it really like to be the person responsible for preparing the dead for eternity? How did you become a mummy maker? What tools did you use? And what happened when things went wrong? Being a mummy maker in ancient Egypt wasn't just a job. It was a sacred calling that connected you directly to the gods. These weren't just morticians or embalmers, as we might think of them today. They were priests, artisans, and guardians of the afterlife, all rolled into one. The official title was Wab Priest, or Pure One, and that purity wasn't just spiritual. Mummy makers had to undergo ritual cleansing before every procedure. They would bathe in the Nile, shave their entire bodies, and wear special white linen garments. Some even abstained from certain foods and activities for days before beginning work on a body. This wasn't a profession you just stumbled into. Most mummy makers inherited their position from their fathers, creating dynasties of embalmers that lasted for generations. These families guarded their secrets closely, passing down techniques through oral tradition and hands-on training that could take decades to master. The training began in childhood. Boys as young as 8 would start by observing, then gradually take on small tasks, like preparing tools or mixing preservation chemicals. By their teens, they might be trusted to wrap fingers or toes. It wasn't until their 20s or 30s that they would be allowed to perform the most sacred parts of the process. The mummy maker's workshop was unlike anything else in ancient Egypt. Located on the west bank of the Nile, the land of the dead where the sun set each day, these facilities were part laboratory, part temple, and part factory. The main workspace was called the Per-Nefer, or House of Beauty, which might seem like an odd name until you understand that Egyptians saw mummification as making the body beautiful for eternity. The central room housed the embalming table, a stone slab with channels carved around the edges to collect fluids. Around the room, shelves lined the walls holding hundreds of tools, chemicals, and supplies. Bronze knives of various sizes and shapes, hooked instruments for brain removal, spoons and ladles for scooping out internal organs, and hundreds of yards of linen strips in different widths. But the real magic happened in the chemical preparation area. Here, mummy makers stored their most precious materials: natron salt from dried lake beds, tree resins imported from far-off lands, beeswax, plant oils, and various aromatic spices. Each mummy maker had his own secret recipes, passed down through generations and jealously guarded from competitors. The smell inside these workshops was overwhelming, a mixture of natron, resin, decomposing flesh, and aromatic oils that visitors described as both sacred and nauseating. Workers burned incense constantly, not just for religious reasons, but to make the environment bearable. Ancient Egyptian society was highly stratified, and the mummification industry reflected this perfectly. At the top were the master embalmers who worked exclusively on royalty and high nobility. These men were wealthy, respected members of society who owned large workshops and employed dozens of workers. Below them were the skilled craftsmen who handled the middle-class clientele, merchants, scribes, and minor officials who could afford quality mummification but not the royal treatment. At the bottom were the basic embalmers, who provided simple mummification for common people using cheaper materials and simpler techniques. There was also a specialized group of embalmers who worked exclusively on animals. Ancient Egyptians mummified millions of animals: cats, dogs, birds, crocodiles, even beetles. Some of these animal embalmers became extremely wealthy, catering to pet owners who wanted their beloved animals preserved for the afterlife. The payment system was complex and often involved bartering rather than coins. A basic mummification might cost a farmer several months' worth of grain. A middle-tier mummification could cost a craftsman a year's wages. Many families went into debt to afford proper mummification for their loved ones, sometimes selling land, livestock, or family heirlooms to pay for the process. The mummification process took exactly 70 days, a number chosen because it matched the period when the star Sirius disappeared from the night sky, symbolically representing death and rebirth. Every step was precisely timed and ritualized. Day 1 began with washing the body. The deceased was brought to the workshop, usually within hours of death, to prevent decomposition. The body was stripped, cleaned with palm wine, and laid on the embalming table. The mummy maker would examine the body carefully, looking for injuries, diseases, or other issues that might affect the preservation process. The brain removal came next, and this was where the mummy maker's skill really showed. Using a long bronze instrument with a hooked end, he would insert it through the nostril and break through the thin bone separating the nose from the brain cavity. Then began the delicate process of liquefying and removing the brain tissue. Skilled embalmers could remove a brain completely while leaving the face unmarked and the skull structurally sound. After brain removal, the abdominal incision was made. This cut, about 4 inches long on the left side of the abdomen, was the gateway to removing the internal organs. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines all had to come out. Each organ was removed with specific prayers and rituals. The heart, however, stayed in place. Egyptians believed the heart was the center of intelligence and emotion, necessary for the afterlife judgment. The removed organs weren't thrown away. They were preserved separately in special containers called canopic jars, each protected by a different god. The body cavity was thoroughly cleaned and then packed with natron salt, a naturally occurring mixture found in dried lake beds. Natron was the key to the entire process. It drew moisture out of tissues while creating an alkaline environment that prevented bacterial growth, but using it required serious skill. Too little and the body would decay, too much and the skin would become brittle and crack. The body was completely covered in natron and left to dehydrate for exactly 40 days. During this time, the mummy maker would check on it regularly, sometimes adding more natron or adjusting the positioning. The transformation was dramatic. What started as a normal human body would shrink, darken, and become leather-like. After 40 days, the natron was removed and the body was washed again. Now came the restoration phase. The dehydrated body looked nothing like the person in life. It was shrunken, discolored, and often grotesquely altered. The mummy maker's job was to restore a more lifelike appearance. This involved stuffing the body cavities with linen, sawdust, or even mud to restore natural proportions. Sometimes, artificial eyes were inserted. The skin was rubbed with oils and resins to make it more supple. Cosmetics were applied. Men and women both received makeup to restore a more lifelike complexion. The final phase was wrapping, and this is where mummy makers showed their true artistry. The wrapping began with the fingers and toes, each individually wrapped with narrow strips of linen. Then the hands and feet, followed by arms and legs. The torso came next, with special attention paid to recreating natural body contours. Finally, the head was wrapped, leaving only the face exposed until the very end. Between the layers of linen, amulets were placed at specific locations. Each amulet had a specific purpose and had to be placed according to religious texts. The scarab beetle over the heart, the eye of Horus on the forehead, protective symbols on the arms and legs. A wealthy mummy might have over 100 amulets distributed throughout the wrappings. The final wrapping of the head was the most sacred moment. The mummy maker would recite specific prayers while covering the face, symbolically preparing the person for their journey to meet Osiris, god of the dead. The last strip of linen was secured with tree resin that hardened into a permanent seal. Ancient Egyptian mummification offered 3 different levels of service, each with its own price point and quality. The premium package was reserved for royalty and the extremely wealthy. These mummies received the full 70-day treatment with the finest materials. The brain removal was done with extreme care. Organs were preserved in beautiful canopic jars, and the body was wrapped in hundreds of yards of the finest linen with gold amulets throughout. The middle-tier service was for merchants, craftsmen, and minor officials. The brain was still removed, but sometimes through methods that were faster but more damaging. The organs were removed and preserved, but in simpler containers. The wrapping used good quality linen, but fewer layers, and less expensive amulets. The basic service was for common people who still wanted some form of preservation. The brain wasn't removed at all. Instead, the body was simply cleaned out through the rectum using special injections. The organs might be left in place or removed without separate preservation. The wrapping was minimal, using whatever linen the family could afford. But even the basic service followed the same religious protocols as the premium version. The prayers were the same, the sacred timing was respected, and the spiritual aspects were never compromised. Mummy makers believed that cutting corners on materials was one thing, but shortchanging the gods was quite another. A typical day for a mummy maker began before dawn with ritual purification. This wasn't just washing, it was a complete spiritual cleansing involving specific prayers, special soaps, and careful attention to removing any impurities that might interfere with the sacred work. The morning was usually spent on detailed work requiring the best light and steady hands, brain removals, organ extractions, or the most delicate wrapping. As the day heated up, activities shifted to tasks that could tolerate higher temperatures. Afternoons might involve consultations with families, preparation of materials, or work on less demanding stages of the process. But the work didn't end when the sun went down. Mummy makers were often called out at all hours when someone died. Death didn't wait for business hours, and the sooner a body reached the workshop, the better the preservation results would be. Family life for mummy makers was complicated by their profession. Many people were uncomfortable around embalmers, believing they carried death energy or bad luck. This social isolation meant that mummy makers often socialized primarily with other mummy makers and their families. Children of mummy makers were often shunned by other children and had limited marriage prospects outside their professional community. The economics of mummification were complex and varied dramatically based on social conditions. During prosperous times, mummy makers could become quite wealthy. During famines or political instability, luxury services like elaborate mummification were among the first things people cut from their budgets. Payment rarely came in the form of coins. Most families paid with goods, grain, livestock, textiles, pottery, or other trade items. This meant mummy makers had to be skilled negotiators and judges of value across many different types of merchandise. The cost of materials was a constant concern. Natron had to be obtained from specific locations and transported over long distances. Tree resins and aromatic oils were imported from other countries. Fine linen was expensive to produce. Competition between workshops was fierce, leading to various marketing strategies. Some embalmers offered payment plans, others provided additional services like funeral ceremonies. The mummification process was shrouded in secrecy, both religious and commercial. Many aspects were considered sacred mysteries that should only be known by initiated priests. From a business perspective, trade secrets were the foundation of competitive advantage. Apprentices often had to swear oaths not to reveal what they learned to competitors. This secrecy extended to the workshop itself. Outsiders were rarely allowed to observe the mummification process. Families delivered their deceased and returned 70 days later to collect the finished mummy, but they typically didn't witness the actual work being done. This isolation bred suspicion and rumors among common people. Despite their expertise, mummy makers sometimes faced disasters. Bodies would occasionally decompose despite proper treatment, usually due to extreme heat, unusual diseases, or delays in getting the body to the workshop. Equipment failures could be catastrophic, a bronze knife breaking during organ removal or contaminated natron causing skin damage could ruin months of work. Legal disputes were common. Families sometimes accused embalmers of providing inferior service or using cheap materials while charging premium prices. Professional accidents were occupational hazards. Cuts from sharp tools could become infected, and exposure to preservation chemicals caused skin problems and respiratory issues. The most serious problems were spiritual. If a mummy maker made significant errors in the religious aspects of the process, using the wrong prayers or violating purification requirements, it was believed to condemn both the deceased and the embalmer to spiritual punishment. The art of mummification evolved and adapted over thousands of years before finally fading away as Egypt's culture changed under Greek, Roman, and eventually Christian influence. During the Ptolemaic period, when Greeks ruled Egypt, mummification techniques began to incorporate foreign influences. The quality of mummification also began to decline during later periods. Economic pressures, political instability, and the gradual loss of traditional knowledge led to shortcuts and simplified techniques. The rise of Christianity in Egypt dealt the final blow to professional mummification, as Christian theology emphasized the resurrection of the body rather than its preservation. The last professional mummy makers probably worked sometime in the 4th or 5th century CE, over 3,000 years after the practice began. By then, they were serving a small and dwindling clientele of traditionalists who maintained the old religious practices in secret. The techniques developed by ancient Egyptian mummy makers influenced preservation methods throughout the ancient world. Archaeological evidence continues to reveal new details about these ancient practitioners. Recent discoveries have uncovered workshops with their tools still in place, and CT scans of mummies show the precise techniques used thousands of years ago. The mummy makers of ancient Egypt were far more than simple morticians. They were chemists, artists, priests, and guardians of one of humanity's most enduring beliefs, that death is not the end, but a transformation to something greater. Their work literally created immortality, preserving not just bodies, but an entire civilization's relationship with death and the afterlife. Today, when we see an Egyptian mummy in a museum, we're looking at the product of someone's life work, a craftsman who spent decades perfecting techniques that allowed ordinary mortals to achieve a form of physical immortality. These ancient professionals, working in their aromatic workshops along the Nile, created some of the most enduring artifacts in human history. So there you have it, the incredible world of ancient Egypt's mummy makers. These weren't just people who happened to work with dead bodies. They were highly skilled professionals, spiritual guides, and artists who turned one of humanity's greatest fears into one of our most enduring fascinations. From the sacred workshops along the Nile to the complex social hierarchies that determined who got the premium afterlife package, mummy making was a profession unlike any other in the ancient world. It required technical skill, artistic vision, spiritual dedication, and the stomach to do work that most people couldn't even think about. The next time you see an Egyptian mummy, remember the person who made it possible, someone who got up every morning, said their prayers, sharpened their bronze knives, and went to work creating immortality, one carefully wrapped body at a time. What aspect of the mummy maker's life surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most unusual professions, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more fascinating stories from the ancient world.